which is why waking from trauma is the only way to forestall its endless reiteration. Indeed, in this way, we might say that trauma presents us with a specific responsibility, precisely because it threatens to render us ceaselessly as pure victims who cannot take responsibility for the conditions that we impose upon others. And although trauma cannot be willed away, I think it can, to a certain extent, be worked with, to the extent that we can become mindful of the way in which it threatens to absorb the present into the past, or reenact the past as the present, and so bypasses the experience of historical distance, the interval needed to reflect upon and consider how best to make a history now in light of such a past. If we can return to the scene in Gaza for a moment, I think we can discern something of the difficulty of this task. Some Israeli Jews compelled to evacuate their homes insisted upon constructing memorials to their lives in Gaza modeled on Holocaust memorials. This is, in Zertal's view, a sanctification of the Holocaust that effaces its reality and produces it as a political cliché. Yet other Jews in Israel and the diaspora clearly understand that the Holocaust taught them to care about social justice, the disenfranchisements of people, random violence, and the dangers of unchecked militarization. The difference between such groups is also with the stakes of nationhood and nationalism, since for some, like Uri Ram in Israel and Omar Barghouti, Palestinian human rights activists, the only way toward a just peace is for both sides to live to the side of their nationalisms, resisting the pathos of nationalism itself. Interestingly, it was Edward Said who claims that in the diasporic idea of Judaism, in his book Freud and the Non-European, that in this idea of a diasporic Judaism, one can find reference to a Judaism that makes alliance with, that seeks and supports solidarity with those in our age who suffer vast population transfers, with refugees, exiles, expatriates, and immigrants. And he further characterizes this diasporic Judaism as the diasporic wandering, unresolved, cosmopolitan consciousness of someone who is both inside and outside his or her community. Said finds there, he finds at the origin of Judaism, which of course he elaborates upon in this book very interestingly, as being inaugurated by Moses, an Egyptian, a non-European, right? And how important it is that Judaism is founded by an Egyptian. And in understanding this, he suggests that at the origin of Judaism there is a mixing with otherness, a question of ethical contact, a question of living in proximity with a non-Jew, since not all Egyptians will be Jews, not all Jews will be Egyptians, so there is the chiasmic link there through the figure of Moses. And he even goes so far as to tell us that living in proximity with the non-Jew is constitutive of what it is to be a Jew. Okay, so you're saying, telling us what Judaism is. The strength of this thought, the non-Jew, as it were, founding us once again. The strength of this thought, he tells us, is that it can be articulated in and speak to other besieged identities as well as a troubling, disabling, destabilizing secular wound. Said asks whether we might continue to think this thought of two peoples, Palestinians and Jews, diasporic living together. And of course, what's interesting here is we tend to think of the diasporic as outside the land of Zion, and what he is suggesting, as others have suggested as well, is that diaspora could become the basis for the land itself. And if it were understood, diaspora as the basis of living together, then the diasporic would also be understood as a way of attaining identity only with and through the other, and that this would become the basis for certain binationalism. He asks whether this thought can ever aspire to the condition of politics, and he asks this, of course, before the current situation. Can it ever become the not-so-precarious foundation of the land of Jews and Palestinians, of a binational state in which Israel and Palestine are parts rather than antagonists of each other's history and underlying reality? I would like to query further, is it precisely through a politics of this kind that affirms the irresolution of identity that binationalism becomes thinkable? In 1984, Levy spoke again about Israel after a self-imposed period of censorship, and he embraced this notion of the diaspora for the Jewish people. In response to a questioner, he said, "I've thought about this a great deal. The center is in the diaspora. It is coming back to the diaspora. I would prefer the center of gravity of Judaism to stay outside Israel." And then again, "I would say that the best of Jewish culture is bound to the fact of being dispersed, polycentric. The history of the diaspora has been a history of persecution, but also of interethnic exchange and relations. In other words, a school for tolerance," end quote. So I've gone on a bit too long. All right, and let me close and return to Levy again. Felicitous. Strange. I'm enjoying the dissonance a lot. He understood the Holocaust, Levy did, to provide a moral framework for his own criticisms of Israel, and he wouldn't listen to those who said that in his position he ought to remain silent. At least he wouldn't listen for a long time. On the eve of his departure to revisit Auschwitz in 1982, to commemorate it, he signed the open letter in La Repubblica calling for the withdrawal of Israeli troops from Lebanon. He refused to understand the Israeli army as representing a persecuted minority. The discourse of persecution could not be used for such a purpose, and over and against those who would revive the images of the camps to authorize Israeli aggression, he wrote provocatively in Il Manifesto, "Everybody is somebody's Jew, and today the Palestinians are the Jews of the Israelis," end quote. Of course, this is a controversial claim, and I think we have to finally reject it as an unwise formulation. After all, if Levy says that the Palestinians are the Jews of the Israelis, he's transposing the victimized position of the Jews under the Nazis to the victimized position of the Palestinians under the Israelis. And I think that this is a crude and cynical use of a Holocaustal resonance, precisely the kind I'm arguing against. But consider that he's also saying that just as the Jew is persecuted under the Nazis, so others can be in the position of being persecuted, and if we equate the Jew with the persecuted, then today others can be Jews, including Palestinians. Further, Israelis, understood as the Israeli government, are not the same as Jews. When asked later about his controversial formulation, he made clear that he did not think that Begin and Sharon were Nazis. Okay? And in response to yet another interviewer who came after him, after he made this outrageous formulation, from La Repubblica, that interviewer asked, "Are the Palestinians in the same position as the Jews under the Nazis? Say it again, won't you?" He replied that he didn't accept such simplistic analogies and that there was no policy he knew of to exterminate the Palestinians. When after Sabra and Shatila, he joined with other Italian and Jewish intellectuals to ask both Begin and Sharon to resign, he was also horrified by the anti-Semitic slogans that suddenly appeared on the walls of his town, Turin, equating Jews with Nazis. Okay, so his words came back to him on the walls of the town, and he was, I think fair to say, flooded with remorse. This was for him a radically untenable situation, and it produced for him a conflict. Could he continue to elaborate those principles, as he understood them, derived from his experience of Auschwitz, to condemn state violence without contributing to an anti-Semitic seizure of the event? This was the issue he had to negotiate. Within a few months of these anti-Semitic slogans appearing on the walls of his town, Levy fell silent on the issue and even descended into a serious depression, one that doubtless had several causes, but could not have been helped by the impasse that was before him.